And this one is called annotations. So when we annotate something, that means we're taking notes in the margins. We may be highlighting things directly on the piece. So when we're annotating, we're taking notes in the margins of the paper. We may be taking notes directly on the document. So we may be using words. So an example of this, if we're taking notes in the margins, we're taking notes off to the side here. If we are circling things, highlighting things directly in here, that's all annotating. Now, some of you guys are doing one of the worst things that you can do with note-taking, which is writing all the stuff down on the board. You want to focus? Yeah, I saw like the faces of devastation right there. So, one of the things that you need to remember with taking notes is that if you copy everything on the board down, then you're not listening to what's being said. So you who were copying these things down while I was talking about annotating, you weren't grasping the concept as completely and as thoroughly as if you were just writing it down as I was talking. So you were focusing on these other methods and getting these other things written down instead of focusing on what annotating is. Annotating is the first one because it's the most important. So annotations are when we take notes in the margins. Where are the margins on a piece of paper? Off to the side. Do you have to stay on the right side or the left side? It is usually best for you to write on the left side unless you have questions. Questions are usually better left for the right side of the paper. So we typically write questions.
So you said annotation is taking notes?
Taking notes directly on the piece of paper or directly on the book. Whatever it is, taking notes directly on it. So if you have a novel, it's writing in the novel. If you have a piece of paper, it's writing directly on the piece of paper. So questions need to go on the right-handed side. And then I'm going to show you what goes on the left. I'm going to talk to you about those pieces here in just a minute. So when is it appropriate to use annotations? When is it okay to use annotations? Okay. When you have a question, can you always write directly on the whatever you're reading? No. Josh took one of my books home over the weekend. If he had written in that thing, I'd be yelling at him, Josh, you can't write in my stuff. These novels are mine, so if you borrow something from the library, you can't write in that. If you have something printed off that you're going to be able to forever keep, you can write on that. But can you write on a computer screen in A+? No. So you have to, annotations, it's directly on the document. So you can only do that in certain circumstances. When you have something in front of you that you own, Josh showed me a book of his, he can write in his own book. That's fine. But you can't write in someone else's book. You can't write directly on the computer screen. So we have to use annotations when we can take it with us or when we can actually write on those pieces. It's important that you make sure you ask your teacher if you can write notes on the piece of paper. So let's say that you get something from your biology class. Your biology teacher, Miss Rhea, she gives you a piece of paper that has some really great instructions, but you want to add something to that. You want to add to whatever she's saying. If she says that's okay, then you go ahead and you start writing. But she may say, no, you can't write notes on that because that you can use on your text. Whereas if you have something with notes, you may not be able to use it on a test. So you have to make sure that you can write notes in the margins of whatever it is. I'm going to show you what goes on the left side here in just a few minutes as we go through and talk about a few other types. Charting is very simple. So charting is just making a list. So the chart is just a simple list of some kind. It can be with visuals. So what we mean by creating a chart, this is something that typically you do on a separate piece of paper. For those of you who are going to have maybe an upper level economy course or financial foundation, something like that, you may create some charts. So you may have something, Nick was showing the students the other day, product times cost times annual amount. So this was the formula. And then they had to come up with 5 products they used each week. And then they had to chart the amount that they spent on those. So that's just creating a chart for themselves. That's something that you can do for yourself if you find that helpful. We don't use charting very often. It's more difficult and it usually takes a bit more time. It's something that calls for a bit more complex thought. So charting is not something that we use very often. It is not something that you are probably going to use in English class. The next one is mapping. So mapping is like a web. Some of you may be familiar with it as a web. But you map out concepts or ideas. So you start with an idea in the center, and then you have something that relates to that. Here, and then another idea here. And you can just keep adding to that. This is really great to use for a novel. So this is something that my students in English 3, that my students do in that class. So they do what we call character maps. So one of the novels they're reading is The Outsiders. So they have, in the center, they have the characters. Just the name, the word characters. And then off in one bubble, they have the character Ponyboy. In another bubble, they have Dairy. In another bubble, they have Cherry. Huh? That's the names of the characters. Yeah. So in those bubbles, they then add even more details. So if my idea over here, my concept is about Ponyboy, and this one is about Dairy. This one is about Cherry. I just like things that run on.
I didn't realize that. I didn't know that was that person in that movie. I know Ponyboy and Dairy. That's the only ones I knew of. I didn't know Cherry was in it.
If I have a detail about Dairy, where is that going to go? Down here. It's going to go up here with him. It has to go where that detail belongs. So if I have something about the two brothers, Dairy and Ponyboy, where do I put that? I can link those two things together, like that, and then bring an idea out. Good. When could you use this? Besides characters, when could you use this? When would you ever use this? Okay, good. This is one that we use a lot when we're writing stories. So students will get their ideas out. Think of it as purging yourself of all of your ideas, just getting everything out there. It's in a visual format, so you can start to look at things and go, oh, is that even a word? You can look at things and go, yeah, that makes sense. That could relate to that in whatever way. So you can start to see relationships usually a bit more clearly with the map. It's a very visual component, so we use it a lot in English classes. It's also something that you can use in certain classes like biology, because you can start to build relationships amongst things. So this is another great strategy. The next one we'll talk about is outlining. Outlining is one of the most difficult concepts, but it's one that students try to use. So this is layering ideas. So you layer ideas up on top of each other. The thing with outlining is it follows a very strict format. So outlining has Roman numerals. And then, yes.
And I'm going to go talk to Mike.
Okay, all right. So you start with ideas, and then you have sub-ideas or sub-categories. So again, this idea are the characters. So if A is Pony Boy, and B is Derry, and C is Cherry. If I have a detail about Pony Boy, where do I put that? Under A. But it goes under it, so you have to go in a layer to have a detail. Otherwise, it looks like it's all underneath this idea. So with this one, think about it like an umbrella. Okay, I'm going to freak somebody out here. I'm going to do this inside.
This is bad luck.
Dude,
No.
it's okay.
Cats are going to fly over.
So with these, we have one idea underneath. So if I have all the technology underneath one idea, I don't introduce coffee. That doesn't work. But if I have all the beverages underneath one, then I don't introduce a pen. That doesn't make sense. So we have to keep everything under that umbrella idea. Now, if you guys see me get struck by lightning, it's my own fault. Blame myself.
Is it really bad luck to open an umbrella inside?
Yes.
It is. I just do the daredevil.
Actually,
I would do that.
a budding Buddhist, so I believe in karma. I don't believe in luck. So layering these ideas underneath others, this is great, but what happens when you have two things and you want to add a third? Well, now I've got to go back and I've got to move it around and I've got to move this down so I can now add a 3. And then if I want to add a 4, I've got to really scrunch it in here and things start to run together. So outlining is great when you're getting ready to write something. It's also helpful when you're just reorganizing your notes. But for the most part, this is something that you want to stay away from because it does become more complicated.
Until you get to that stage. Pretty much.
Even at that stage, so I'll tell you that most of my history courses in college, my professors, they gave you an outline. So they put it on a transparency, they showed you the outline, and then they were out there talking and talking and talking and talking. And you're so busy writing everything down because you know that stuff's going to be on the test, but what they're saying is going to be on the test. But your arm is so exhausted because you're just writing down every single thing that's on there, plus you're trying to catch some stuff that they're saying. It was nearly impossible. It's a horrible way to teach, too, which is why I try not to do that. So outlining is something that it really works well when you're doing it yourself, for yourself. So I outlined my thesis. Oh, I took it to my office, maybe. So my thesis is 157 pages. So I had to get some outlines together to organize my thoughts. So when you're writing yourself, yes, outlining is helpful. Josh?
Yes, what?
My thesis, my master's thesis, when you get a master's degree, you have to do a thesis. So you have to write about something that you really, really researched and maybe did some practice. It was a nightmare. When I was doing my master's degree, my master's program. Miss Sheila? So another method is what we call the Cornell method. So the Cornell method is very similar to a double entry journal. So Cornell has 2 sides. And with those 2 sides, on one side you have a concept, an idea, or a question. And on the other side, you explain those things. Do you have a question? Ladies, do you have a question? Okay. So on one side, you have a concept or an idea. On the other side, you explain it. On one side, you have a question. On the other side, you answer it. Now, where do you get the answer to the question?
From the explain.
Most of the time, you're going to be able to continue reading and get the answer to your question. Sometimes you're not going to be able to get the answer to your question, but most of the time those questions are substantial, so you need to probably talk to your peers, other people who've read it, or talk to your teacher to get the answer to that question. Thomas? Yep. May have. Okay. That's quieter. Thank you. So the Cornell method, when could we possibly use the Cornell method?
When you're doing something about a story.
Okay. So this might be helpful when you're writing your own stuff. It's usually more helpful when you're reading. So why do you think when you're reading, if you're writing the idea over here and explaining it over here, writing any questions and answering them, why do you think that would be helpful?
Because then you're organized and you're not going all over the place and you're not going off track.
Good.
You know, like Johnny went off on the bus or, you know, whatnot.
So one of the reasons that you guys are in here is because your Lexile levels are below 1,000. So in order to get onto English 3, your Lexile level has to be 1,000 or above. And your writing has to match up with that as well. So in order to increase your comprehension, remember last week when we were talking about those neurons firing off? So you need the fireworks going off in your brain. This helps you connect so the fireworks start going off. Because you are connecting and you're focusing in on what it is that you're reading.
Can I give you an example?
Mm-hmm.
This morning I had to sit on my stuff and my youngest daughter Edith looked at it and was like, ooh, just by the front of it, she wanted to read it. And so I told her, I said, well, every night we'll read a chapter.
Good. So as you're reading, if you engage in it more, and that's great, especially when you're interested in something, but you guys are going to be reading a lot of stuff that you're bored by. You're just absolutely going to be bored by. So we have to engage in it in some way. So the Cornell method is a popular method. It's one that you can use for reading comprehension, but reading comprehension in any course. So if you are given something to read in Financial Foundations, or you're given something to read that's a historical document, or you're given something to read for one of your science classes, you can use this method for any kind of reading comprehension. Do you think this works for math?
Maybe.
Good.
Okay, it does actually work for math. So over here, you can have whatever that function is, and then over here, you can have some examples. Those examples usually help us understand the information even better. You can develop questions. It's the same thing. You can use it even for math. And I don't say that very often in English class. I don't like to talk about math in here. It stresses me out. Double entry journal. So a double entry journal is very similar to this. You break it up into 2 even sides. And over here you have one thing, and over here you have something else. So it has 2 sides. This one is, what's that?
Say it again.
Again. This one has a very specific format, so concept on one side and questions. This can be whatever you want it to be.
Could you have an example what the corner?
Yeah, I'm going to give those out later. So this is one I use very heavily. I took French and Spanish through high school for 4 years. As I was doing that, I would put the French over here and the English over here.
You're doing double entry now, right?
Yes.
I can't write that.
Je suis. That's fine. Just put hola. I did this for Spanish too. So what's the benefit of doing this? What can you now do with this piece of paper?
Using for information.
You can fold it in half and you can quiz yourself or other people can quiz you. So this is really great for vocabulary.
Could you use that?
You could. Mm-hmm. Yep. So it's very similar to what Natasha was just saying. So using flashcards. So on one side you have one part and the other side you have the other part. It's the same thing. Essentially, it's the same concept. So what else could you use this for besides vocabulary?
Your verbs and nouns.
Okay, you could use this for nouns. You could use this for verbs. So you could have train, noun, milks, which several of you missed, is a verb.
Writing?
What's that?
I said writing.
Writing. How could you use this for writing? Okay, so you could use this for, like I did, for specific vocabulary. With writing, you could also use this. You could have a character over here, and then you could have a lot of details about that character over here. I use this a lot when I have students doing 2 different things. So my students used to write a summary and response essay. So over here they would have their summary, and on this side they would have their response. I can spell. So anything that was about the summary, it was over here. Over here was anything that came from them, their response. Auschwitz concentration camps. They used to do it over Facebook.
What's the top one next beside 1944?
Old.
Oh.
It's old if it was in 1984 or 1944.
I couldn't tell because the L is like really close together.
1984 was a great year. Thomas was.
Trying to find out. So you're good.
Okay. Okay, so what I want to focus on now is what kind of stuff you put into one of these formats. So remember we talked before about questions. What other things do you think you guys need to write when you're taking notes? What type of information do you think you need to have?
Good information.
Okay, how do you know what's good information?
They're telling us.
What the teacher.
Pick the main. Pick the main important part.
Okay, so you guys are saying, you ladies are saying main idea. Okay, so if I'm giving you some information, you need to figure out what is important. So let me tell you a little piece. So when I first met my kid's dad, we went down to Kentucky that first year, and he's from Bug-Tussle, Kentucky. Yeah, I know. It's a legit place. It has a bait shop and a store, and like you can get sodas there. They're not very good. I think they have worm guts in them. Like you can get everything in one place. And right across from that, there's just this place that everybody knows that's the track. Yeah, it's just a big circle that people have made themselves. So while we were down there, it was around 4th of July, and we were fishing. So I'm from Indiana, so I go fishing a lot from North Ender. We fish and we eat it. So we went noodling for my first time. So noodling is when you stick your hand into an area and you wiggle your finger around and a catfish hooks onto it and they hook onto you and you pull it out. So that was my first experience noodling.
That's a hillbilly fish.
It is. It's also very cheap. But catfish sting. So what I did learn also was that you can rub the catfish skin on where they stung and it will make it go away, make the pain go away. So I learned two things. I learned noodling and I learned catfish sting and how to get rid of that. Okay, teachers do this all the time. We tell you something. Out of what I just said, what should you have taken notes on?
When you about.
The definition of noodling is definitely something that you want to write down. So terms are important. You need to write down terms and the definition of those terms whenever you're having a conversation and you learn a new term. Now, how many of you already knew what noodling was? I saw Justin's eyes lighting up. Yep. So if you already knew what noodling was, do you need to write it down? No.
You know it in your head.
You already know it. It's already in your SpongeBob filing system. So you don't need to mess with it. It's there somewhere. Good. So what else did I say that you should take notes on? Thomas? Okay. So that is one of those main ideas. So one of the main ideas is that I caught the catfish, but I learned something about the skin. How many of you already knew that? Okay. So a couple of you didn't learn anything new that you need to write down. That's okay. If you already knew it, you don't need to write it down.
Catfish don't have teeth either.
Nope, they sting with those fingers.
Yeah, but they're like, their mouth is really hard, that's why.
Their jaws are like, okay, grab one. Huh? Yes, I did. But I like mud a lot. I used to make mud pies a lot.
Do you think you're going
Did you eat them? Oh, I've done it a lot since then. That was back when I was 18.
They might have to have like a fish day.
I love it. Josh?
So pretty much you have the terms and ideas.
Good, yes. Terms and the main ideas there. So, when you are taking in new information, you have to write down any main ideas. This can be a concept that is repeated over and over again. So this is what you guys are going to eventually get to when you have reading passages. The word or words that are repeated are the word or words that you want to write down because that is typically a component of the main idea. So my story, even though I mentioned my kid's dad, even though I mentioned Bug-Tussle, Kentucky, the focus was on fishing, specifically noodling. So you want to identify what it is that main topic is about. This is something that you guys are really going to have to work on. Some of you have a huge gap between where your Lexile level is and where it needs to be. So in order to decrease that gap and to get you on into English 3, you have to start gaining some stronger comprehension. main idea is composed of those words or words that are repeated. So if I ask you the main idea of what I said, and I gave you options as noodling is fun, noodling is dangerous, Mrs. Warner had an experience noodling,
Or how you had to do it.
Mrs. Warner had to overcome getting stung by a catfish when she was noodling. That last one encompasses everything, whereas the other three are limited. So you want to make sure that when we're looking at your notes, when you're reading something, you're identifying what are the key words that are repeated over and over again. And you want to write that down. The other thing that you want to write down and make sure that you include is any unfamiliar vocabulary. Remember, this is unfamiliar vocabulary. This is not stuff you already knew. Do words only have one meaning? No. Noodling is a concept. It's an idea. If we change it a little bit, it means something else. So it's important that if it's unfamiliar, you write it down and make sure that you're clued into the actual definition of the word. The last thing that you want to include are any questions that you may have. So Thomas asked, well, have you been noodling since then? And I said, well, yeah, that was 20 years ago. So heck yeah, I've been noodling a lot since then. That question isn't going to necessarily matter in his comprehension, but that's something additional that he wanted to know. So you want to write down any questions that you may have. You want to have the main idea, and this is when you're annotating, you want to have the main idea over on the left-hand side and any questions on the right-hand side. Why do you think you would separate them like that? So you don't get confused, and so you can make sure that you have answers to those questions. You need answers to those questions. Good. So this is the information that you will eventually have in one of these formats. We are going to be focusing mostly on annotations because that method I find most helpful for reading comprehension. But we're also going to be using this Cornell method. And that is because you guys are going to be reading some of my books, and you can't write in my books. When you are taking notes, you have to figure out what works for you. So a couple of hints on this. If you don't like to capitalize I in your notes, don't capitalize I in your notes. If you write Y-O-U with just a U, that's okay in your notes. Now when you translate that to me, it better be capitalized, and you better have a Y-O and U on top of that. But when you're writing it quickly, just get the major details down in whatever fashion makes you feel comfortable. I have a lot of students who are ESL students, so Spanish is their native language. Instead of them thinking about what they heard and then translating that in their head and then writing that down, just write it in whatever language you feel comfortable with. In addition to this, I would also suggest to you guys that when you have a course that you're really struggling with, that you ask if you can record that course. So I grab Dennis's phone all the time and I put it on record so he can hear me. And he has a recording of what it is that I'm saying. But make sure that you always approve that with your instructor first. Especially we talked a little bit about plagiarism and cheating. It's an academic, no, not an academic, an educational integrity, something, there's a word for it. If you record somebody and you're not supposed to. I had a student who actually got in a lot of trouble for that at a conference in Florida. It was bad. She was recording the speaker, and she did not have permission to do that. Intellectual integrity, that's what it is. So we have this intellectual property that we're giving to you, and unless you have permission to use that, or record that, then you're not allowed to do that. So just talk to your teachers. Most of the time, we don't care. All right. So we are going to practice this when we get back. Another thing that I would also suggest for those of you who like to revisit your notes, taking screenshots of the board. I grab Dennis's phone all the time and I take pictures of the board.
That's
So-
allowed, okay.
Yeah.
I'll do that, that'd probably be better for
I
me.
did that in the A1 class, so I took, on part of the house.
Mm-hmm.
I took, the phone I was bringing in and I took pictures of it
Good.
where I could see, but then.
And again, you can't necessarily use that for your test, but that may help remind you of the information. I'm on my phone a lot more than I'm in my notebooks. Okay.
Me too.
All right, I'm going to give you guys 10 minutes. So 10:10. Come back at 10:10.
Okay. Oh! Are you guys standing here? Sure you were. Sure you were. Wasn't I gonna fall?
No, I didn't. When I got my coat. Yeah.
So warm up.
Butterworm, lifesaver.
Are they? Yeah. They taste like butterscotch.
Kinda.
Yeah.
A different flavor to it.
Yeah. I'll have to get my dad some of those for his birthday tomorrow. If he likes that kind of stuff.
Walgreens.
Walgreens? Okay. I love one.
Do you have any books that can read for your book magazine?
Mhm.
Books?
Mm-hmm. I've heard what's in mine.
Because I already saw reading again. I'm in trouble, honestly, I know. Do that. Do that.
You're welcome.
Remember what chapter I was on?
Was it 8?